We left off defining a community and talking about what a community is. We spent a little bit of time last week talking about last week and Tuesday talking about populations and wanted to expand that to a community being interacting populations. And so what I want to do today is talk a little bit about things that affect ecology at the community level. And I want to start by just defining this idea of coevolution. So we started our class talking about evolution, and now as we start to think about communities and we're thinking about populations that are interacting with each other, we're really starting to look at coevolutionary processes. And so coevolution is just a series of reciprocal evolutionary adaptations between two species. So if you look at the picture that I have on the slide here, you'll see that we have a moth and the flower that it pollinates. This structure is the moth's tongue, okay? It has this really long tongue that it uses to get at, the nectar of this flower, which is actually housed all the way in here. And this is this like adaptation after adaptation after adaptation of the flower wanting a better pollinator, and so making its nectar hard to get. So in the process of trying to get in there and get that nectar, the moth is going to get this pollen on its body and then take that to the next flower it feeds on, and then that way cross pollinate members of the same species. And so when we look at a community, whether we're looking at a pollinator and plant relationship, whether we're looking at a predator-prey relationship, whether we're looking at competition between two species that eat the same kind of food, we often see these coevolutionary processes happening where one species adapts and then the other one is going to adapt lockstep with it. And so we see these species that are kind of moving forward through evolutionary time together. And that means that if something happens to one of these species, there's an impact on the other. If this moth were to go extinct, how is this flower going to get pollinated, right? So when we start to think about community ecology, we're thinking at this next level where we're really starting to think about how these interactions play out and how species affect each other. I think that I don't know. I would have to look up the species again. As soon as that picture came up, I was like, no, I can't remember. It might actually be pollen that's attached to the moth's face, but I'm not sure. Also, like this picture is very much staged. I don't think this moth is still alive. It may be being displayed that way. I, yeah, I don't think that that's true, but it could be. We'd have to look up the species. Okay, so in community ecology, we're really talking about interspecific interactions, interactions between members of two different species, the relationships between them, how these relationships between species affect the structure and dynamics of the participating populations, right? If you have a predator, the prey population is greatly impacted by what's happening with the predator population, right? The reverse is also true. Whatever's happening in the prey population greatly impacts the predator. These things are interlinked. There's also indirect effects in the non-participating members of the community. And what we mean by non-participating is if you have a predator and its prey, and these two species are interacting, another species that neither of them directly interacts with may actually be impacted by them. So if you think of something like a beetle who feeds on the feces of the prey species, right? If something happens to that prey species, then now the beetle might be affected, even though it's not directly interacting with that animal, okay? These kinds of interactions help to structure the community, and they're going to be based on whether there's a benefit or a harm to the members that are participating in the interaction. So I'm going to use pluses and minuses in these slides to indicate a species that's benefiting or a species that is being harmed by the interaction. We talked a little bit about interspecific competition on Tuesday, and we said that this is when populations of two or more different species compete for the same limited resource. we have lots of different possible resources. Food and water and space are common things to think about. In this particular image here, I have nesting sites. And so this woodpecker actually creates the hole that it nests in, and it creates a new hole every year. So it uses its hole for one nesting season, and then it abandons it. Once it's been abandoned, other species like wrens and bluebirds and starlings and a whole assortment of other species are going to come in and use that as a nesting resource. So that's a resource that is created by one species, used by the others, and is in limited supply because there's only so many abandoned woodpecker holes to be had in any given nesting season. So there's going to be competition for who gets to that space first and who gets the best nest to use for their nest that season. When we think about this competing for resources, we have to think about how much does the niche of the organisms overlap. And so I want to take a minute and define the ecological niche. And this is just how an organism uses its environment. Okay, what it eats, where it sleeps, where it makes its nest, what kind of resources it needs on hand, how it uses the abiotic environment. All of those things are part of the organism's niche. Okay, what it requires in order to be successful. And so if we think about a simple warbler, a little bird, that bird is going to need, if it's going to carry out reproduction, it's going to need nest sites. It's going to need materials to build its nest. It's going to need insects to eat. It's going to need the abiotic environment that's conducive to survival for it. So it's going to need the right temperature and the right moisture level and humidity and precipitation. All of those things are important, right? So if we have two different species of warbler, they're going to have really similar needs. They're going to be eating similar kinds of things because they're closely related birds. They're going to be nesting and probably in similar types of place. But we can see that species one and species two, although they have some things that are directly in overlap, they're also going to have some things that are different. And so maybe species one eats these 5 species of insects, and species two eats 2 of the same insects that species one does, and 3 different insects, right? And so there's a place where they're not in perfect overlap. And so all of those components of what an organism needs makes up its niche. And we can determine how intensely organisms are competing with each other by how much those niches overlap. So in this case, if we have 2 different species of warbler and their niches overlap a little bit there in the middle, in that overlap place, they're actually both negatively impacting each other because that's a place where they're competing over access to a food source or over access to nesting materials or something like that. And so when competition is occurring in this space, these 2 species are impacting each other. And so the amount of overlap in their niches is going to tell you how intense that competition is. If those were to scoot together, so that they overlapped maybe this far into each individual's niche, then competition would be more intense, right? They would be battling more fiercely in order to get the things that they need to survive. If they are members of the same species, their niches overlap completely. So the most intense competition is always members of the same species because they have the exact same needs, right? Within a population, 2 individual male birds might be competing for attention of the same female, right? There's going to be a direct competition there. And so the greater that niche overlap is, the greater the intensity of the competition. Does that make sense? For sure. So one of the things we talked about, that's great putting that together. When we were talking about insects, we said that one of the ways that insects are so successful is through metamorphosis alleviating competition so that parents don't compete with their offsprings for food resources. So if you think about an adult monarch butterfly, their food resources are nectar from flowers, right? If you think about a juvenile monarch butterfly, its food resource is leaves of the milkweed plant. So they are not eating the same thing. So their overlap opens up, right? They're occupying different places on the plant. They're moving different areas. They really reduce that competition with each other. Whereas 2 adult butterflies are going to be in complete overlap. Yeah, it's a great perspective. Okay, so competition is one of the things that lowers the carrying capacity of a species. When a species has to compete with other species, its population can't be as high, right? So that population is going to be interacting with members of its own population, and that's going to impact how many can live in that space. But then the number of competitors it has outside of its own species will also impact its carrying capacity, right? If it's competing intensively with several other things that are eating the same kind of food, we have to have fewer of that species in order for it to be able to get its needs met. Does that make sense? Okay. So when we have multiple species living in the same place at the same time, we refer to that as coexistence. So species who are occupying the same place at the same time are coexisting. They're getting along at the same place and they're existing at the same time, right? Not all species are able to coexist successfully. So in many cases, if one species moves into an area, it might exterminate a species from that area because they're not able to coexist. Okay. This usually happens if the niche overlap is too intense and they can't both all get their needs met, or if you have like an invasive species comes in and is able to have higher numbers and those numbers sort of swarm over the native species might have to leave, not be able to survive in that environment. Okay, so not all species can coexist successfully, and we'll see that examples of how that works in just a second. You guys have this slide? A bunch of you were writing. Hmm? Humans are a pretty good example. Yeah, right. We have outcompeted many species and exterminated them from the environment. Yeah, it's not funny. It's true though. Huh? We're jerks. Yeah, kind of. So when two species cannot coexist, this is due to what is defined as the competitive exclusion principle. And so the competitive exclusion principle just says that one species will outcompete the other to the point of extinction. And when we very first started studying competition in the lab, they set up these artificial environments. And in these environments, they were growing paramecium. So if you guys maybe remember paramecium from our single-celled protist lab, they were growing paramecium in a flask of nutrient broth. And if you grow those paramecium in separate flasks, we have two different species here, Aurelia and Caudatum. If you grow them in separate flasks, their populations grow in a very similar logistic growth pattern, and they have similar total numbers in a flask of the same nutrients. If you put those two species into the same flask, they both grow at a lower intensity to begin with, and then the caudatum species really takes off, and the Aurelia continues to grow slowly, and then at some point here, caudatum just crashes down to zero, and Aurelia is able to survive at a lower overall population size. And so in that case, they weren't able to compete successfully. They weren't able to coexist. In order for the Aurelia species to continue to survive, it had to completely eliminate caudatum. And so that sort of exhibits competitive exclusion. And like Riley said, humans are a great example of competitive exclusion, right? Our persistence in spaces often removes other species from existing in that space. We cannot coexist reasonably, and instead the presence of one species causes the other to go extinct. But fortunately, this is not always the case. There are times where species are able to coexist and live in the same space, and they do this through what's known as resource partitioning. And resource partitioning was first described by a researcher named MacArthur, and MacArthur was studying warblers. The group of species he studies is sometimes referred to as MacArthur's warblers. This was a pretty landmark experiment when it was done. And basically what he did is he went out and watched warblers feed in the forest, and he timed with a stopwatch how much time each species spent feeding, and he recorded where in the tree they were feeding. And what he found is that they reduced their overlap in their niches and give themselves some relief so that they can coexist by specializing in different portions of the tree. So if you look in this diagram down here, the yellow rumped warbler only feeds in the bottom branches of the tree. It doesn't feed up in the top 2/3 of the tree at all. It really stays down in the bottom of the tree. The bay-breasted warbler feeds higher in the tree, feeding a lot on the outer edges, but going through the center, kind of in the mid portion of the tree. The Cape May warbler only feeds in the very upper branches of the tree. The black-throated green warbler is similar to the bay-breasted warbler, but it actually spends a little more time inwards towards the trunk and less time out on the periphery branches. And then the Blackburnian warbler only feeds on the outer branches, never moving into the core of the tree. And so depending on the species of insects that they're feeding on, there may actually also be some differential distribution of those insects, some insects being found mostly on the trunk and large branches, others being found out on the fine branches. They might be, if you're out on the fine branches, you might be clipping things out of the air, whereas on the inner branches, you're more likely to be pulling them off of the trunk or off of the branches themselves. But by distributing where they feed, they reduce that interspecific competition. They spread themselves out a little bit, and therefore all of these species are able to live in this same spruce forest, whereas they would, if they all fed, in the exact same spot on the tree, they wouldn't all be able to feed there. They would outcompete each other. So that's called resource partitioning. All right. Does anybody have any questions about competition? It can happen with different organisms. This particular group of warblers are closely related. They are all members of the same genus, unless they've been reorganized since the last time I checked. And they are closely related in terms of their niches and how they make their living. And so they are closely, but you might have two species that are not particularly closely related that are feeding in a really similar way. Like we could have a bird that is feeding in a similar way to a large predaceous insect, right? And they could overlap even though they're not closely related at all. Yeah. Yeah. And this is certainly not the only example of this. This is just the first example, right? This is the person who described this concept. So we use his research as an example. But there are lots of examples of organisms doing those same things, or spreading themselves out in space so that everybody has their needs met and more species are able to live there. And probably that comes less from an idea of like, hey, let's all share our habitat, and more from like, how do we make a living? Well, somebody else has really got the market cornered on that center branch insect. I'm going to go eat these ones out here on the periphery because I can get at them, right? Okay, so our next topic that I want to talk about is is a case where one species benefits by harming another species. So predators and parasites. So we use the term predation anytime one organism feeds on another and kills it. Okay. So anytime one organism feeds on another and it results in that other organism's death. So in this case, this is always the organism who's doing the feeding benefits. The organism who's being eaten does not benefit, right? They have a cost. It costs them their life. So plants are typically described as herbivory, but we will use the term predation if they consume the entire plant and destroy it. Herbivory is sometimes like separate from predation, how I have it here, and sometimes herbivory is kind of nested as a sub within predation. But herbivory is when an animal feeds on a plant and the plant is damaged but doesn't usually die. And so, in many cases, an animal feeding on a plant is going to eat some of the leaves, but not all. Or it's going to eat some of the flowers, but not all. It's going to drink, some of the resources, but the plant still survives. So I don't really want, something to come and chew my arm off, but I could live without my arm, right? I'm damaged, but I'm still alive. So the feeder still has the positive gain. The plant that's being fed upon is impacted. In some cases, it might cost its ability to reproduce that year. It might not have any growth that year, but it's not usually killed. And um, we do use the term predator and parasite in response to plants when the outcome is death or when it's receiving a parasitic interaction. And so the predation is not exclusive to animals. And some people use these terms more precisely and others use them more very specifically. Um, Parasitism involves one organism feeding on another, and the host organism may or may not be killed, but it's certainly impacted negatively, right? Has anybody actually got a tick embedded in their forest excursions? Not here. Like several people are saying yes. Over time, sure. I was thinking of from last week, but not from last week. Just checking in. But over time, some of you have had ticks before, right? It doesn't kill you, but it impacts you negatively, drinks some of your blood. Some parasites do actually kill their hosts, and in that way, that relationship is more extreme. It kind of depends on the host parasite relationship. In many cases, it's actually to the benefit of the parasite not to kill their host because they want to make sure that their host is still around to feed on in the future. So you might, if you have an insect that lays its eggs in a flower head, it might only infect some of the flowers on each plant, but leave some flowers uninfected because it wants the plant to produce some seeds for next year so that it can feed its offspring in the future. Okay. Predation obviously is going to negatively impact survival, and thus that has a big impact on reproduction, right? If you die, you can't make any offspring. So this has a huge consequence for you evolutionarily. I basically just like every excuse to show this picture. This is a short-eared owl, and this is a northern harrier, and they are fighting over this meadow vole. It doesn't really matter who wins this battle to the meadow vole, right? The meadow vole loses no matter what. It's over for the prey item. It's not going to survive. Therefore, everything is impacted. The harrier has it in hand right now. I don't remember. I have notes somewhere about the story for this. I don't remember who originally made the catch or who won. I don't remember. I don't know if I have the notes there or not. Did I show you guys the video of the newt being eaten by the garter or the newt in the garter snake? I did, right? We did that in natural selection. Okay. So that's an example of what we call an evolutionary arms race. Predation frequently results in an evolutionary arms race where there's this like step by step over evolutionary time kind of amping up of defense mechanisms and the ability to defeat those defense mechanisms. And so this newt is a great example of this. This is the rough-skinned newt. You can see its textured surface, and it has a very bright yellow underbelly under its tail, under its arm, its whole underside, its whole ventral side is bright yellow. And so this newt has evolved the ability to produce enough toxin to kill a huge quantity of snakes. Um, but the snakes have also evolved a resistance to the toxin. And so there's this like balance back and forth where sometimes the snakes still die if their resistance level isn't high enough. And sometimes the newts still get eaten because the snake has a high resistance and it keeps amping up so that the most resistant newts live over time, the most resistant or most defensive snakes live over time, and we end up with this kind of out of control evolutionary arms race. This individual is exhibiting what we call warning coloration, so it's bright colors to advertise that it's dangerous, and it has a legitimate chemical defense. It can kill you if you eat it, right? So that is an example of a chemical defense. We're going to go through some of the things that predators and prey use in this interaction. A chemical defense is anything that makes a prey undesirable to eat. And so classic example is monarch caterpillars feed on milkweed because they get a toxin from the milkweed sap. So that white milky sap of the milkweed has a chemical in it that makes birds sick when they eat it. So the caterpillar now has that chemical in its body, and the bird will get sick if it eats it. That's actually strong enough that when this caterpillar undergoes metamorphosis and becomes a butterfly, the butterfly actually retains that toxin in its system and it is still toxic to eat. So chemical defenses might cause the predator to be sick. It might cause them to die. It also might get them high. And so there are some examples of organisms eating certain prey items who have a toxin or eating certain plants that have a toxin because they then have a drug-like effect. And